Take a look at this whole sequence of little articles. Starts with Sieghart's professions as the conscience of society, then continues with Downey's response, and then finally Sieghart's brief response to Downey's response. The aim I think, of this essay by Sieghart is to conceptualize what the fundamental, I would say, the fundamental defining or constitutive relationship is that makes a profession. For Sieghart, the professional is made by their relationship with their client. In the case of a doctor, we say patient, but that is really the real insight here, or the real thesis here, you may say. Of course, it may be wrong, and as we know, that what it's leading up to is this relationship of what does he call it? The gross inequality of power, gross disproportion of power between the professional and the client. And this is set up by this section called The Foundations of Ethics, in which he basically says that ethics begins with relationships between human beings, ignoring the question of animals, which is a very important question, obviously, but for the purposes of his essay, not really very relevant. Telling the Robinson Crusoe story, basically, that if you have a human being who is alone on an island, there's no ethics, right? There's no ethics because there's no relationship. That for Robinson Crusoe, the ethics begins when he realizes there's another human being there. As he says on page 118, the case of Robinson Crusoe the case of Robinson Crusoe in a state of solitude may seem trivial and obvious, and I use it only to illustrate what I conceive to be the starting point of all morality, namely that it can only come into existence in the context of a relationship between a human being and some other entity, which is really, that's extremely interesting. So what needs to be in place for one to be in an ethical situation? You must be in some sort of connection, relationship with another human being. And then that continues. What else needs to be the case to be in an ethical relationship or an ethical situation? He says that fleeting mention of cannibalism serves to introduce my next elementary proposition, the first being that you have to be in this relationship, which is that interpersonal moral problems only present themselves to an individual when his or her interests come into conflict with the interests of another. Moral problems do not arise in a paradise of abundance where all wishes can be instantly gratified without anyone having to make any effort, let alone inflicting any hurt or deprivation on another. They arise only in our finite world of shortage and suffering, in which the gratification of our desires necessarily entails competition with others, and in which the pleasure of some is achieved only too often at the cost of the pain of others. Basically reiterating an old observation, I believe it was made by David Hume in the 18th century, that if we lived in a world of perfect abundance where all of our desires were met instantly, that there'd be no need for, say, something like justice, because everyone would always get what they wanted. There'd be no conflicts, and there'd be no need for thinking about just distribution of goods or whose desires have priority over whose. But we don't live in such a world, so we live in a world where we need to think about things like justice and ethics. In that situation, he continues, let me again start with the simplest case where the interpersonal relationship is confined to two individuals, say you and me. We are both hungry and there's only one portion of water, or we may both need shelter and there's only one hut, which cannot accommodate two at a time. Our interests conflict. That's what's important. How are they to be resolved? Right. Okay. In essence, we have two options: to compete or to cooperate. If we compete, we shall fight for the booty, and whichever one of us proves to be the stronger will get all of it, and the other will get none. If we cooperate, we shall share it on some terms, half each perhaps, or you today and me tomorrow. And here's the important part, or the most important part, I think, here in this paragraph. Note here that each of these options can be expressed as a rule of conduct. In the one case, let the stronger win. In the other case, let each have a share regardless of strength. And since morality is essentially about rules of conduct, each of these statements constitutes a moral precept, and the choice of one of them in preference to the other constitutes a moral choice. Perhaps the most fundamental of all moral choices, namely whether in any given situation we should prefer selfishness or altruism. Selfishness is self-explanatory. It's doing something for yourself. And selfishness is just acting in your own self-interest without regard to anyone else's interest. Altruism is sacrifice of your interest to some extent. Altruism is doing something for someone else without regard to your own profit, self-interest, etc. So altruism always, to be altruism, requires some kind of sacrifice. It doesn't have to be a huge sacrifice, but I can never be said to have engaged in an altruistic act if it didn't cost me anything. If I didn't give up the satisfaction of some desire or sacrifice some good for me in order to achieve a good for another. So this choice between selfishness and altruism is of course, very important for his conceptualization of the professional relationship. Okay, so this moves us to the second major part of the essay, professional ethics. And this is really important, right? That is, okay, what constitutes or what defines the professional client relationship? He says, with that introduction, let me come to the subject of professional ethics. Like other moral questions, those of professionals can only arise in the context of a relationship. So this has been very influential on me. You know, the idea of a profession. Is engineering a profession? The great challenge is this statement here that the professional relationship is constituted, well, being a professional is defined by being in a relationship with somebody. This is why engineering is so ambiguous or so unclear whether it is a profession, because it's not, at least in terms of the employed engineer, it's not clear whether this relationship actually exists. Whatever the profession, whether it is that of the physician, the lawyer, the priest, or any other, the principal feature of such a relationship is that of a gross inequality of power. Okay, this is such an important part of this essay. The idea that, well, as he says, almost by definition, the patient or client is weak, vulnerable, and in need of help. The professional is strong, skillful, and specially qualified to give that help. Instantly, therefore, a moral choice arises, right, as he's set up in his general theory of ethics, for the stronger of the two, that is, for the professional. Should he follow the rule of selfishness and help himself to what he can at the expense of the weaker, or should he behave altruistically and share with him what he has to give? So, I mean, this may be a little bit far-fetched, but what he's saying is that every professional in their relationship with their client is faced with a choice between selfishness and altruism. And his conclusion or his views on that are very clear, if not entirely logical, but Excuse me, I'll be right back. Sorry about the interruption. Yeah, where were we? We were right here. The importance of this relationship of the gross inequality of power. That is worth thinking about. Okay, I mean that is worth thinking about because it beyond the scope of this essay, it paints a picture, or it emphasizes what, to me, it was very important to read this because that it emphasizes the real heart of the notion of professionalism, or being a profession, or being a member of a profession, is that the professional has these special skills. The professional has the knowledge, the skills, the capacities that the client does not have. The only thing that's really missing here, I think, in Sieghart's account is the kind of skills that they have. Because, as we'll see when Downey attacks this idea, he points out that all sorts of jobs have special skills that their customers don't have. And here you kind of have to supplement what Sieghart says with some consciousness of the history of the professions and what sort of occupations have been commonly called professions: medicine, law, religious, clergy occupations, the military. Is that they not only have special skills, they have special skills in areas of special importance: people's bodies, people's freedom and property, national security. In terms of religious occupations, the state of someone's soul. So that the vulnerabilities of the client are vulnerabilities in areas that are vital areas to human life. If you are a religious person, that's got to be considered a vital area of your life, your spiritual well-being, your state of your soul. So I think that I would like to point that out, that's an important thing, and I think it comes up in Sieghart's response to Downey's response, and I'll point out why. So, okay, right here, after stating what this relationship of gross inequality of power, he says, now the outstanding characteristic of all professions is that their members are bound, without exception or qualification, to choose the second of these modes of conduct and not the first. That is, to choose altruism over selfishness. That the worst thing that a professional can do is to take advantage of their client. The cardinal sin of any professional, and the prime ground for his expulsion from the profession, is to prefer his own interest to that of his patient or client. In an emergency, the physician must turn out at all hours of the day or night in order to minister to his patient's needs. So must the lawyer, and so must the priest. So must the engineer. Well, I don't know. You tell me. It is a grievous wrong for the physician to prescribe or perform any unnecessary procedure, or for the lawyer to advise or conduct an unnecessary lawsuit. Within a professional relationship, altruism is paramount, and self-interest has no place. The professional has a duty, regardless of his own interest, to put his skills at the service of those who need them. This is the paradigm, I think, rightly or wrongly. Maybe it's misleading, but this is the paradigm of professionalism: is that it is service. That the professional is engaged in a service to people, the people who happen to be their clients or patients or whatever, parishioners. And this is it. This is it. Okay. Now, whether it's a mistake to think that this is it, okay. But this is, as far as the rock bottom foundation of the idea of a profession, this is it, that it is a service thing, that the professional serves humanity. And there, right here, he says, it is striking how profoundly this ethos differs from the rule of conduct applicable to every other market in the supply of goods or services. And this is something, again, that Downey attacks. But the idea is that in business, it's okay to be selfish. In business, apparently it's okay to take advantage of people. In business, it's okay, within the law, to do anything that maximizes profits. So for Sieghart, there's this big contrast between professional ethics and the ethics of business that is on this area of self-interest. That it's okay to be self-interested in business. It's not okay to be self-interested as a professional. The other big idea, of course, so the idea is that the professional, everything is in the service of the client. That the professional is more or less selfless. The professional is doing everything in service of the client. But of course, there's one other big idea that sets a limit to that, and that is the idea of the noble cause, which is described immediately after this. And he gives this example of a doctor who could help his patient by poisoning somebody else, but that'd be obviously wrong. But why? Well, because even more obligatory or even more important to the professional than the good of their client is what he calls the noble cause, which serves as a kind of a limit to what the professional can do for the client. And of course, this gets us into some very interesting areas in terms of the first canon, which is more or less an expression of the noble cause of the engineer to protect and promote the welfare of humanity, of the public. But the noble cause is the doctor cannot poison somebody, even if it would help their particular client, because that would violate the noble cause of medicine, which is a promotion, as he says, the promotion of health and the alleviation of suffering at the bottom of here, right? That's why a lawyer cannot do something unjust in order to exonerate their client, right? I guess if you're a clergyman or clergy person, you can't imperil someone else's soul to save the soul of your parishioner or whatever, So this idea of the noble cause, that the professions are all, it's not just altruism that characterizes the profession, it's also the allegiance to a noble cause that characterizes the profession.